I am the Assistant Academic Director at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities here at Bard College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our thoughtful, tough talk featuring Dr. Catherine Liu, Abolish Small Liberal Arts Colleges! Virtue Hoarding and the Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. Tonight's talk is part of the Thoughtful Tough Talks program, which is a student-run initiative to create a civil and respectful space for meaningful conversations around potentially divisive issues. For example, abolishing the place that you work and study at. To this end, the initiative offers speakers, attendees, and student hosts the opportunity to engage with and experience ideas and the people who hold them that may challenge their own prejudices and convictions, as well as to articulate and communicate their viewpoints on objections to and criticisms of a particular position. As Hannah Arendt writes, only in the freedom of our speaking with one another does the world, as that about which we speak, emerge in its objectivity and visibility from all sides. Tonight's event is the last of the Hannah Arendt Center's student-run spring events, and so I'd like to take a moment to just acknowledge a few people, including our founder and director, Roger Berkowitz. We want to thank him for supporting and guiding the work of the fellows and myself this year. And Phil Lindsay, our communications coordinator. Tia Stanton, who's not here but is the executive director at the Hannah Arendt Center. And most importantly, I would like to recognize our amazing group of Hannah Arendt Center student fellows. Our Courage to Be fellows, Naomi Miller, Elsa Joyner, and intern Di, and then also, sorry if I rushed through your applause, Elsa. We'll pick that up later. And also our Tough Talks fellows, Ishmael Vicente Delgado, Maggie Huff. The fellows, no, that was right. I'm like, just got on this one. The fellows are really a dynamic and essential part of working and making the Hannah Arendt Center work. And it's been my first year here, and they have made it a wonderful experience for me, so thank you all. And finally now, I'm going to introduce tonight's student host, Hannah Arendt Center student fellow, Leo Cronin. Leo invited Catherine Liu, organized the event, and has been taking care of all logistics from big to small. And Leo is a first year at Bard. He's pursuing a dual degree within the college and the conservatory, hoping to major in both political studies and vocal performance. Leo is a member of the inaugural class of vocal performance majors in the conservatory, currently studying in the studio of Professor Rufus Muller. Before coming to Bard, Leo worked primarily with many civic-oriented organizations and campaigns, most notably as a fellow for When We All Vote, a nonprofit founded by former First Lady Michelle Obama, dedicated to youth-targeted voter registration efforts. Leo hopes to pursue a career in education policy and is beyond excited to be working as a Tough Talks student fellow at the Arendt Center for the 2021-2022 season. Welcome, Leo, and welcome.
Thank you. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Catherine Liu. Catherine Liu is a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. She's the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, and American Idyll, Academic Anti-Elitism and as Cultural Critique. She has published extensively on critical theory and new Taiwan cinema and psychoanalysis. She's also a novelist. She published Oriental Girls Desire Romance and is completing a memoir called Panda Gifts. She is currently writing a follow-up to Virtue Hoarders on trauma and how the PMC reworks the script of authenticity for late capitalism. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Catherine Liu.
Thank you so much for having me here, Leo. It was, we had a lot of back and forth because my father-in-law died this spring, and he helped me rearrange the state, and to Tara for all of her support, and to the Hana Red Center for hosting me at this event. I'm going to go, without further ado, into the paper. I prepared more materials than I normally do. So Leo's going to keep me on time here so that we finish my remarks in about 40 minutes and we have ample time for discussion. Okay. So I'm going to go through very quickly certain areas because I have too much stuff. So, allegedly progressive liberal arts colleges hoard educational resources, escalate the culture of academic competition among elites, and all to the detriment of the kinds of general humanities education necessary for a functioning democracy. Small liberal arts colleges like Bard pride themselves on their commitment to liberal arts education, but participate in some very rough realpolitik when it comes to their raw economic interests. According to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal detailing the lobbying efforts of private schools and universities, or the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, or NICU, I call them, they are a K Street outfit, and they've been lobbying against President Biden's proposed free community college policies in his last budget. You can find their full statement on why they're against community colleges online. And this position, this recent development from the past year, 6 months, has me rethinking a recent response to the Chronicle of Higher Education, which asked me to write an essay, why are progressive colleges really progressive? They ixnayed the essay and wanted me to rewrite it. I haven't done it yet, because I'm like, too bad if you don't like it. But, in fact, unless we can get to an open admission, free post-secondary education for all as a universal policy, there is just simply no such thing as a progressive campus. The NICU has largely succeeded in squeezing free community college out of the Biden budget, and as a lobbying group, it pretends that it supports targeted aid to working class and lower income students in the form of expanding Pell Grants. But why can't you have both? Furthermore, even if you double the maximum amount of Pell Grant right now available to lower income students, $6,395, to let's say $1,400 a year, let's be generous. This is what the National Association of Student Financial Aid wants, which is also a lobbying group. You could not pay for half a semester of tuition at the most progressive campuses, including Bard, Oberlin, Amherst, Yale, or Harvard, where 2 semesters of tuition average $55K. It is telling that the Wall Street Journal is covering the role of NICU on free community colleges much more assiduously than the House organ of the PMC, which is the New York Times, its very own Pravda. Rest assured, members of the Bard community, Bard is a good dues-paying member of the NICU. In the competition for private funds, however, Bard has until recently lagged behind its more well-endowed counterparts, including Amherst, Smith, Williams, and Dartmouth. But Leon Botstein's longevity as the president of the college has turned on his ability to transform this idyllic campus on the Hudson into a juggernaut of global innovation and fundraising. Last year, Bard received a pledge of $500 million from donor George Soros, one of the largest gifts ever made to an institution of higher education. By 2019, by 2019, more than a third of Americans over the age of 25 had a college degree, the highest proportion in US history, which is funny because our democracy has never been more in trouble, and yet we keep thinking education is going to make us better citizens. The Professional Managerial Class have made the bachelor's degree a necessary credential for anyone who wants to enter the liberal content-producing professions. In an increasingly stratified and unequal society, inflating the value of a college degree works wonders in the PMC's war against the working class. In colleges, especially small liberal arts colleges, students are learning the language of identity protocols, are able to exercise their sense of entitlement to forms of social interaction that enable them to function and dominate intersubjective relations. In the meantime, liberal leaders find it all the more easy to dismiss the 64% of Americans who fail to earn the degree and as backward at that college degree, as backward and guilty of the societal ills that the PMC has individualized, psychologized, and managed. That said, the vast majority of college students in America do not attend SLACs or small liberal arts colleges. Public universities do most of the work of educating American students, but we rarely hear about individual public university students or attendees. They are the masses, unnamed and faceless, often evoked in images of spring breakers gone wild or football fans dressed in Buckeye regalia. In the popular media and the popular imagination, the attendees of small liberal arts colleges are individualized and significant, if sometimes spoiled. What happens in private colleges take on an outsized importance because these places are the training grounds for the elite members of the professional managerial class who overwhelmingly dominate the ranks of journalists and other content producers. So in the next section, I'm calling it the liberal arts complex. And I'm drawing upon a situation that I wrote about the Catalyst, which is the academic side of Jacobin. And it turns around the situation, an incident at Smith in July 2018, when a student accused a janitor and a cafeteria worker of racial profiling. Smith College is broadly representative of what is happening at other private institutions located in rural areas of the Northeast, such as Amherst, Williams, and Wellesley. And I would say to a certain degree, Bard, but the Dutchess County is actually much more diverse in ethnicity and race than Western Massachusetts. Much more, like marginally more diverse. These colleges have become laboratories of PMC culture, drawing well-educated students from both private high schools and academically excellent public high schools. Like its competitors, Smith has worked hard to diversify its student body and to a lesser extent its faculty. It has attempted to forge the ideals of equity, diversity, and inclusion in colonial-era buildings and idyllic quads behind ivy-covered walls. But its very location vitiates such efforts. Northampton, Massachusetts, like the rest of rural Western Massachusetts, is very white, 88.5% white, according to the latest U.S. Census Bureau. Elite liberal arts colleges like Smith have become islands of cosmopolitanism, diversity, and prosperity in areas that, like most of the rest of rural America, have suffered decades of economic stagnation. In 2019, Northampton's unemployment rate was twice that of Boston's, and its economy is unhealthily reliant on tourism and education. Colleges like Smith employ blue-collar and union workers from the area to clean and repair their quaint campuses, or to serve its diverse student body food in the cafeteria. It draws upon the local employment pool to staff its lower-level administrative positions that guarantee the smooth running of the institution's bureaucracy. Good management of the college's resources means paying these sorts of workers as little as one can get away with, while rewarding famous professors and other administrators to the greatest possible degree. So those who attend institutions like Bard, Smith, Amherst, and Williams may not all hail from the nation's wealthiest 1%, but they do constitute a very special part of the college-going population. In beautiful rural settings, they enjoy intense personal attention from professors who are also graduates of elite institutions. In their small classes, students are able to receive are supposed to receive in isolation from the pressures of family, profession, and market, a well-rounded education in skepticism, curiosity, critical, and general knowledge. This comes with the added bonus of strong networking and social bonds with classmates and alumni alike. This somewhat justifies the tuition fees at Smith, which are close to $80,000 a year now, including tuition and room board, where Bard registers at a marginally more reasonable $74,250 in the 2022 academic year. Until the COVID-19 pandemic, colleges like Smith saw rising numbers of applicants, and Bard as well too. And in terms of endowment and also rate of application and rate of rejection, these are all very important for rankings. And they're benchmarks of success. Smith's Yale-educated president, Kathleen McCartney, left her position as dean of the Harvard School of Education to preside over Smith College. I'm going to summarize this. So what happened in July 2018 was a young woman, African-American woman, was working in a camp at Smith College, and she was taking a nap after lunch in a dining hall area that had been closed. She alleges that a janitor and a cafeteria worker looked at her through an open, through a glass doors or French doors, and called the police on her. She first reported this she posted this to Facebook and received immediately an apology from Kathleen McCartney, the president of the university. So the alleged profiling incident took place on July 31st, 2018. It was immediately covered by CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I remember reading this and thinking, oh my God, how horrible, right? Oh my God, this workers are so horrible. But Canute reported being deeply traumatized by the incident, afraid to go to sleep in her room, and unable to resume normal life on campus. Kathleen McCartney offered a public apology to Canute and immediately suspended the janitor who had called the police on her. None of the initial reporting raised any questions about McCartney's apology or the worker's immediate suspension. Canute referred to him in social media posts as a racist punk. The Washington Post quoted Philip Goff, the president for the Center of Policing Equity, in this way, quote, "For many folks, the police are seen as the racism valet," end quote. The story appeared to confirm liberal suspicions about a toxic and deeply entrenched strain of racism among working class whites. So now, after this immediate publicity and apology from McCartney and the suspension of the janitor, Smith finally commissioned an independent third-party investigation. The investigation was publicly released in October 2018, 3 months after the reported incident. Smith hired a very reputable law firm named the Sangabi Law Firm to interview everyone involved. The report that the Sangabi Law Firm drafted denied that there was any racism motivating the suspended employee's call to the police, but then immediately Smith alumni and the ACLU and the students at Smith denounced the report itself. The investigators interviewed the caller, and the Tyler Hall cafeteria worker was accused of racist profiling in the presence of their union representatives. The report made public the nature of the exchange between Canute and Jackie Blair, who had served the student food before the incident, as well as the exchange between Canute, janitor, and the police officer. The janitor, who was in his 60s, made a terrible mistake when he called the police that day. Canute was right to assert that he could have come over to talk to her before doing so. However, the police was not armed, as she claimed, and his recorded interaction with her was extremely polite and apologetic. So, in February 2021, the New York Times published a lengthy investigative journalism piece about the incident by Michael Powell. So far, up until that point, only conservative figures talked about working class people involved in the drama, and Canute named them in subsequent Facebook posts and they received death threats, both of them. Mark Patenaude was one of the two he's named now, was one of the two Smith employees misidentified. Well, Mark Patenaude was misidentified with Smith by Canute as being someone who called police center. He was not on campus that day. When he was interviewed by the New York Times, he said, "We used to joke, don't let a rich student report you, because if you do, you're gone." The joke is one of the few accurate things that have been said about the employee-student administration relationships at Smith. While manufacturing jobs disappeared from New England, post-industrial service work has expanded, with a feminized workforce doing the work of maintaining the American prestige economy, supporting the liberal professions and the culture industry. In the post-industrial workplace, where service is key, worker discipline takes the form of constant surveillance by customers and technology. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild analyzed this regime of affectual self-management in her book, The Managed Heart, a study of flight attendants in the 1970s and bill collectors. Hochschild emphasized that the presentation of the correct attitude is a critical part of post-industrial service work. Patenaude describes a situation where a cafeteria or a janitorial worker at Smith must not only do her job well, but must also produce the correct service attitude towards students or risk being denounced and fired. Working class sociologist Jack Metzger, in his study of working class professional middle class differences, would describe Patenaude's strategy as one in which the worker performs deference in a purely pragmatic way in order to maintain some modicum of control over his or her employment. Canute also named a cafeteria worker, Jackie Blair, in this incident. Jackie Blair was not involved at all. She served her food and maybe had a conversation with the janitor. Despite the findings of the report, Kathleen McCartney asked that Jackie Blair participate in a mediated session of reparative justice with Canute. And Blair actually did not do the did not produce deferential attitude at this point. She said, "I'm not going to participate in this session because I did nothing wrong." So the 2018 incident at Smith allegorizes the way elites have sought to suppress discussion of working class employment conditions in a world with a pitifully frayed social safety net. In the absence of national health care, loss of employment is nothing less than catastrophic for any worker. McCartney can disguise her abuse of power as a boss by referring to misguided and distorted ideas of progressive campus politics and social justice. But we have to ask ourselves, what kind of education Smith is actually offering its students by having its president behave with impunity by suspending workers in this way? Furthermore, we should ask whether Smith and other institutions like it should exist at all, and what social function private colleges perform in constructing themselves as an illusory classless community. Because McCartney kept saying, our community must heal, we must heal the community, as if there was this like classless, idyllic group of people over which she presided, kind of like a lady, or Nicholas O'Leary, needing to discipline sometimes her workers and also, and nurture students. So if these places do not serve education for education's sake any longer, but have applied a cosmetic veneer of social justice to their educational systems, quite well adapted to corporate America's relentless demand for allegiance and compliance to its grifter-friendly qualities of innovation and entrepreneurship. One of the things that I glossed over was the fact that under Kathleen McCartney's reign at Smith, she's become much more business friendly. The humanities majors have dropped a great number. She's promoting science and business. I think Botstein did that too many years ago when I was here. And on Smith's website it says, we're preparing young women for the C-suite. Young CEO. So it is time now to think about dissolving private colleges and their endowments and merging them with public institutions. I have suggested elsewhere that Smith and the 5-college consortium could easily dissolve their endowments and be merged with the University of Massachusetts Amherst. The State University of New York system, we should also emphasize, has suffered for years. The SUNY name is one that the University of Albany and the University of Buffalo don't even want to associate themselves with anymore. They want to, more and more public institutions are being starved and forced to raise private funds, which is why we don't call SUNY Albany, it's called the University of Albany now. Restructuring public higher education, though, by merging Bard's liberal arts ethos with the large number of students served by New York's public university system, would be a first step in reforming beleaguered institutions that serve many, many times the students that Bard does. If working towards structural equality is a liberal and liberal arts goal, the dissolution of private college endowments should be a step that we as a nation are willing to contemplate. When Bernie Sanders proposed free public higher education for all, it was an admirable policy, but it was one that preserved the structural gap between public universities, community colleges, and their private and their elite counterparts. Now is the time to be bold about imagining a different future, one founded on liberating and socializing for the public good the education and wealth that have been stockpiled and distorted by a corrupt class of courtiers to capital. And now, I don't know where I am in terms of time. Now I have a very long. As the higher education credential has become critical for entry into the white collar world, paying for college with loans as financialized instruments has crippled generations of college graduates. The most ambitious and successful of these graduates, like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, will not lead the way out of the economic, social, and cultural catastrophe of a politically and economically polarized society. In fact, institutions of higher education have betrayed democratic values and universal programs and are actively making the political and economic landscape of the United States more reactionary and less free, more oppressive and less equal or democratic. They have betrayed the very principles of liberalism, skepticism, and the free exercise of reason in order to adapt themselves to the needs of the donor class. The betrayal of the values of liberalism is to be expected in institutions that must serve the order of capitalism. The only way, I argue, to protect STEM and humanities research from the demands of the market and its donor bosses is to nationalize all universities and their endowments while providing free top-tier post-secondary education to all who want it. The more elite American universities and colleges wrap themselves in the cloak of the language of pseudo-progress with the term inclusion at its empty heart, the more hypocritical and insulting their language of diversity and equity appear to the hungry, the broke, the intelligent, the ordinary, angry young person. As university endowments explode, their rates of acceptance drop, and tuition rises, student debt expands, the more unequal and volatile, the less inclusive we become in the higher education sector. Campus progressivism is materially divorced from the material concerns of the majority of people in this country. But elite college graduates are frenetically trying to cover up the betrayal of liberalism at the heart of their education. Pseudo-progressivism is part of their class identity, and they dominate now the Democratic Party and the liberal and cultural industry professions to an even greater extent than when John and Barbara Ehrenreich wrote their essay in 1977 about the professional managerial class. So, many sociologists, left sociologists of higher education have argued over and over again that increasing access to elite education does almost nothing to solve the problem of inequality we face as a social whole. For better or worse, the critiques of the European Enlightenment that come out of the idea of social progress European Enlightenment come out of the ideal of social progress promulgated by the Enlightenment. Ideas about scientific method and reason and universal human dignity were forged in the 18th century coffee houses and salons, well away from royal academies and the cloistered universities of that period. For the Enlightenment, intellectual freedom, the freedom to question all things, including the existence of God. Nothing would be sacred, nothing would be safe from critique. Free thinking was accompanied by demythologization and an affirmation of liberty, in eros, as in science. If today we can attack empire and colonialism and racism and sexism and all forms of bias from within a university setting, it is because we believe in the power of reason to promote equality, to denounce injustice, to bring down tyrants, to promote freedom and equality. No one taught me about the Enlightenment while I was at Yale as an undergraduate in the 80s, because after the turmoil of the 1960s, it was very uncool to teach, much less study, the European 18th century and its messy, violent yearnings. I happened to stumble upon the Frankfurt School and Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment on my own and began to read the period for its politics and historical significance. Professors and graduate students can flagellate ourselves all we want for our privilege or our complicity with colonialism, imperialism, Eurocentrism, all we like. But the equality of women, people of color, queer and trans people, comes from an idea of Enlightenment universalism. From Adorno and Horkheimer's point of view, Enlightenment also radiated disaster, as its reason became instrumentalized in the Nazi killing fields and in capitalism's ability to extract profits from the lives and resources destroyed by its infernal worldview. The emancipation of the working class, the overturning of the capitalist system, those ideas came after the 18th century with the work of Karl Marx, whose insistence about the universalism of exploitation, the universalism of the logic of commodity and class structure, make him an Enlightenment thinker as well, and make him very unpopular in today's liberal pluralistic, in the pluralistic liberalism at the heart of many forms of queer theory, of critical theory. So I just want to say that he's making a comeback, so I shouldn't be so dark and negative. It was in 20th century American progressive education, in the early part of the 20th century, that the ideas of universalism were first critiqued in America, in John Dewey's idea of education for industrial democracy. The most radical aspects, however, of Deweyan progressive education, small class size, holistic education, treating each child like a scientist, artist, or researcher, rewarding intellectual and aesthetic curiosity, and encouraging hands-on learning, have become now the exclusive purview of private schools, like his own Chicago Lab School, which today is proud not of its ability to produce good citizens, but rather its ability to graduate Ivy League admittees. Tuition for Lab School in Chicago was $36K a year for high school. Other famous progressive schools founded by leftists and educational visionaries, such as Little Red Schoolhouse and St. Anne's, both top $50K a year in tuition. Progressive education has become a luxury item. And in the absence of democratic politics and socialized progressive education, progressive education is not progressive at all. This was the point I was making earlier. And as Dewey envisioned the United States as moving from an era of untrammeled exploitation and working class suffering to one that would be shaped by the forces of industrial democracy, he promoted progressive education as a, facilitator of this transition from the order of tyranny to the order of progress. I have very ambivalent feelings about this because while I think it is very important, this overinvestment in education as a social elevator really begins with Deweyan thought. The upper reaches of the PMC have taught us to ignore raw economic inequality while accepting their language of progress, special language of progress. Instead of working class student, administrators at the UC want us to say first-gen student. The term promotes the ambition in working class students to divorce themselves from previous generations of uneducated kinship circles. Inclusivity instead of equality is also a rating managerial ideal meant to disguise the violence of selection that adheres to the raw elitism of our educational institutions. Managerial talk of inclusivity allows the selection of members of minority populations once excluded from institutions, even poor and working class students, to strengthen the identity or brand of the institutions that continue to reproduce the ideology of sorting, competition, and social elevator from bottom to up. I'm just going to give you an example, though, of how the ideology of this kind of selectivity is even ringing hollow for the very leaders of these organizations. In his Q&A with the Atlantic Monthly, Princeton President Christopher Eisgruber responds to journalist Emma Green's provocation, "Why should Princeton exist?" by repeating the adjective extraordinary 6 times. He insists that Princeton is a place that invests in extraordinary talent and lists Alan Turing, marginally associated with Princeton, and Sonia Sotomayor as the extraordinary Princetonians, of which he is so inordinately proud. Eisgruber is a progressive man. He supported the removal of the name Woodrow Wilson from the School of Public and International Affairs because of Wilson's colonial racist attitudes. He purports to be worried about diversity and access, and boasts that today a whopping 7% of Princeton's extraordinary undergraduates are Pell Grant recipients. In his recent book, Bridging the Divide, Working Class Culture and Middle Class Society, Jack Metzger argues almost like he anticipates this use of the word extraordinary because he argues for ordinariness, this came out in 2021, as a critical value that he imbibed in the mill town of Johnson, Pennsylvania, where he grew up. He's in his 70s now, so he lived in a relatively stable working class community of the post-war period. And he finds value in the way of life and the set of values shunned by PMC elites. He finds that in the working class worlds in which he grew up, which are anti-aspirational, they emphasize being and belonging rather than becoming and striving. I totally admit to being guilty. I'm on the guilty side of these things, of this dialectic. So I would like to quote at length from Metzger's book, which he admits is based on 4 decades of teaching and writing in a working class serving university in Chicago. In a section called Valuing Mediocrity, Metzger writes, "Let me say straight away that an individual mediocre life like mine is not very interesting. My life in particular has lacked trauma and drama, mostly through luck, but not without a little intentional design. But mediocrity in the mass is a lot more interesting than you might think. First, of course, because it is so common, and second, because it's not as common as it used to be, either as ideal or reality. People aspire to mediocrity, and many work hard to achieve it, as I have. That sounds ridiculous only in an elite culture, which includes most of the mass media, that is constantly banging on about greatness and excellence and always looks for the extraordinary, whether Nobel Prize winner or a mass murderer. In a social class whose culture is by turns anxious about and intoxicated by status, however, being a mediocrity means being just average, which is synonymous with being a failure." End quote. Metzger has given us an analysis of Eisgruber's hyperbolic and anxious rhetoric. And in his book, he argues that valuing the working class ethos of skepticism and realism with regard to aspiration and achievement would be a social good for everyone of every class. I'm not as much of an optimist as Metzger about class harmony, but its use of working class historian Barbara Jensen's analysis of working class culture, which emphasizes the being and belonging that is opposed to PMC's constant investment in becoming, has become a powerful critique of the rhetoric in which my own, much more anxious relationship to class and mobility is steeped. The reason why SPAR should not exist is simple. In small liberal arts colleges, the language of liberalism and progressivism, while portraying its very principles, as in the 9Q Lafayette Street Community College, shows that progressive politics, like progressive education, completely lose their core meaning when they appear as luxury goods for the few rather than the many. Popular anti-intellectualism and popular resentment of non-ends-oriented forms of learning, like the liberal arts education that we're allegedly getting here, should not be reserved for the extraordinary few. Ordinary people should not worry about the market pressures or the pressures of pursuing knowledge if they so wanted. They should be able to pursue aesthetic experience. The most ordinary person has every right to the aesthetic experience that is now being sequestered in these small liberal arts colleges. I know Bard has done a really good job of distinguishing itself from their small liberal arts colleges by saying that it promotes the lesser practice arts. My university, there's an institute for writing and translation that promotes lesser used languages. Well, these kinds of things should not, these kinds of activities should not be luxury activities. The most elite, wealthy, and extraordinary students have accepted the iron regime of competition in the free market. They have internalized the discipline necessary for the most narrow forms of success in self-fashioning. In fact, I would say that what they're extraordinary at is the extraordinary degree to which they've internalized the competitive ethos of late capitalism. In every elite university and college, scientific research is increasingly oriented towards profit-making endeavors. Physics and pure math are abandoned for computer science. Humanities and arts majors are seeing lower enrollments every year. The ambitious Ivy League grad wants to be the next baby Mark Zuckerberg, and the more economically anxious ones just want to make a big paycheck. In fact, it should be emphasized that liberal and liberal arts values are being abandoned by the most extraordinary of our students. The demand for profit, the fear of falling, and the anxiety about competition have completely decimated classical liberal arts education and its respect for holistic and historical forms of knowledge. No need to decolonize the curriculum. There soon won't be one left to criticize, as we all work on problem sets and case studies. To give cover to their greed-driven peers, the more liberal of elite college grads are majoring in activism, at the ready to run NGOs, work briefly as community organizers, invest in the pseudo-progressive novelist Abolish kind of charity as political work that will get them into a top 10 law school. Progressive campus politics at places like Bard actually work to give existential and ideological cover to the exclusionary, deeply anti-democratic drive that is embedded in the sectarian and anti-liberal ethos of today's institutions of higher education. Pity the ordinary student, the ordinary person, the ordinary citizen in our ailing democracy. Without a massive reorganization of higher education, including the nationalization of small liberal colleges like Bard and the redistribution of its resources, the rage of the ordinary person will continue to seed right-wing reaction and precipitate endless culture wars, which in the end flatter the narcissism of people like us, while doing nothing to correct the damage wrought by a system that allows capitalists to hoard surplus value while doling it out in bits and pieces for tax breaks. Is this how the liberal arts are to remain liberal under the current regime of an exploitative economy where our best and most valuable roles are to play courtiers and jesters in the imaginations of the billionaire class? That's a question I think. Okay.
So we're going to open it for a Q&A in a few minutes, but Dr. Liu, I have one specific question for you, Catherine. So in your book, Virtue Hoarders, you mentioned that you were second generation PMC. And in your speech, you said, you mentioned the example of UC Irvine making professors say students who identify as first-gen to be called first-gen students. So I was wondering if you could expand and describe the differences in power between each generation of PMC as they evolve.
Well, the only reason why I'm second generation PMC is because my father got a job during the Mad Men era, where if you were a man and you wore a suit and you were marginally smart, you got a really good job. He passed an examination which allowed him to be a translator of the United Nations. My mother never finished the 8th grade. So in that sense, I am like first gen on that side. But it was really the social democratic nature of the post-war period, or les 30 glorieuses, as the French said, the economic miracle that lifted people like him out of a working class position into the stable, into a fairly stable PMC job, where in a year after working at the UN, he was able to buy a house in suburban New York on one salary, have support 3 children, and buy a Volvo. So he had, been born in a home with no running water, with no electricity. This story is extremely common. My father-in-law just passed away, was born a year after my father. Similar trajectory. He worked in the civil service. He was a Beamte in West Germany. Great pension, great health care. That was a really specific post-war moment when you could say that those dreams of social mobility moved forward were realized because of massive state spending in rebuilding the infrastructure of both Western Europe and investment in the United States in terms of infrastructure after the post-war period. Many of the gains were achieved because in 1947, 4 million Americans went on strike, including the US steelworkers, to demand better conditions, better working conditions. So all of that, raised the level of working conditions for everyone. After that, after World War II, the union said, we worked our asses off to help you win this war. We need better working conditions. In a way, we're seeing that happen right now after the pandemic, well, as the pandemic dies down, because all of these people who work to keep our Amazon packages coming are saying, we work to make your lives more or less functional. We need more of that surplus value that Marx talks about and that, the capitalist class has been hoarding and distributing to us, like George Soros to you. Thank you, George. So it's not like an abstract thing where I can say, Generation 1, PMC, Generation 2, PMC, does this. For me, a lot of my anger is that I believed, because I lived so far outside of the white-collar profession, outside of the educated world, that having more education was a key to being more enlightened. So, and to be, because I was just extremely naive, like a better person. You know how they tell, this is how, in the book I say remember when Obama was reading and I'm so full of empathy and reading is so good for you because it makes you more empathetic? Well then if that were true, English departments would be filled with saints. No, that is not true. So, right, PMC. So my disillusionment as a second generation PMC is because I did have those illusions. I thought English, I believed the propaganda, I drank the Kool-Aid. I was I'm going to be among these PhDs, we're going to be talking about ideas, everything's going to be so free, and English departments are full of saints. And then I arrived in this profession, and the kinds of so the hypocrisy and the moral turpitude and the dishonesty could have been something that people are, people more inured to this world sort of let go. And for me, every time it was a massive blow to my fantasies.
So I think we'll open it up to a Q&A. We have our mic runner, so I guess raise your hand if you have any questions.
So yeah, that wasn't a great answer to the question, but it was,
No
I just wanted to specify that. Then I grew up in a time when austerity was happening. The competition was more and more intense. Student loan debt was exploding. And so the PMs, if you went to Berkeley in 1965, your tuition was zero. So there was materially a greater degree of freedom that you could have if you went to college without worrying about your financial plight afterwards. So the second, third generation, your generation finally has been fully your education has been fully financialized. Student loan debt is a financial instrument from which private banks profit.
Is this, yeah, okay. So I kind of have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna try to put it together to one thing, hopefully. First of all, thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate everything that you had to say. And thank you to Leo for organizing this. So I guess my biggest question is, what is, based on all of this that you said, what do you think you or like future generations of students should do when looking into secondary education? Because I know, a big draw of the small liberal arts environment is this fantasy that you're describing of like not to say that it doesn't exist for some people, but like you said, it's sort of a fantasy of having like personal attention in classes and all these things. And having like a really idyllic environment. Do you think that an appropriate response would be for students to kind of divest from these kinds of institutions by not applying to them, or do you think?
No, because that is saying that like your personal choice will matter. It doesn't.
Okay.
Okay, that's like a very like ideological thing that we're told. Like, if I recycle, I'm saving the world. No, you're not. And if you choose not to come to a SLAC, it doesn't matter because the thing is just bigger than us. We have to fight for policies that will create greater equality. National health care, really simple. Free community college, very simple thing that will immediately improve things. If the UC tuition goes down to 0 again, it will be hell to pay for all of the other private institutions. I mean, we're not there yet because it is such a good public university, see, that like immediately everyone will have to bring the prices down. So it is, in New York State, one of the reasons why the SUNYs suffer so much is because the private colleges' lobby groups in Albany are so powerful that they promote this defunding of the universities, public universities, in favor of, Pell Grants or financial aided instruments in private colleges and universities. So if anyone tries to give you advice on an individual level, that's just not right. You have to have a macro idea of what's happening. And to have a critical view of the world is, first of all, to say, my individual choice just doesn't matter. I can learn from what I've been through. But this is like the whole, readjustment that I want to fight for. Because we've been told ever since capitalism began, that if you work really hard, you succeed. If you recycle, you save the world. If you drive a Prius, you're saving the world. In California, I just profited from this. Get solar panels on your house. You're saving the world. And you know what? We're not saving the world. We've got a huge tax break, which is not good for California. The people of my class pay less taxes, right? But I'm saving the world because I got solar panels. It's not I just was I was just taking advantage of this, but don't ever delude yourself that individual choice can become, even in an aggregate, a political force. You have to have a brutal, macro, structural analysis of the situation.
I was also, thank you so much. I just wanted to add really quick, I'm curious, what do you think about the nature of pedagogy or the way that liberal arts education works? Do you think that some of that is too inextricably linked to this elitism, that if these institutions were nationalized, as you said, it would have to lead to a kind of radical new approach, not radical, but the small class sizes or this kind of personal attention, which is, it's not a bad thing, but I don't know, how do you think that idea of pedagogy would change?
Well, right now we've overproduced graduate students to a great degree, and if we could have the graduate student employed to teach properly, then we could have small class sizes for everyone, because we have too many PhDs and too few jobs, actually. So if we generalize that and said, you can get a PhD, you can teach small class, and we have a national WPA system for humanities for professors, then what we should have is this small class size for everyone. We should normalize that. what I'm saying? Because we actually can't do it, we have to work it.
So I just have an expanded thought on that. When you mentioned SUNY, there was a huge movement last year during the mayoral election, the city council elections for free CUNY, and where kind of the presidents of the CUNY system basically demanded Governor Huckle to give.
You say the name?
I think it's Huckle. Huckle? Is it Huckle? Huckle. Okay.
I love Huckle. It's like Huckleberry.
So they demanded to the governor that she give the institution $500 million, and then that the city council then added additional funding to make the tuition free.
Okay.
Hochul gave CUNY 25% of what they wanted, added $600 million to Buffalo Bills Stadium, and then the city council has yet to do anything. So where we see the UC system where they're at a rate of academic where they can slowly or no. But when you have an underfunded institution, what are your thoughts on it?
What do you mean, when you have a hundred?
So when you look at like the UC system versus the CUNY system.
Right. CUNY provides a remarkably good education for its resources. So we've lived with austerity for so long in our public institutions. I do want to say that they've become if we do nationalize and develop these endowments, we also have to change the whole structure of the administration, because one of the things that's happened at large public universities, as you know, and I'm not sure if it's happened at Bard, is that there's a level of administration that sucks up all the resources. So there has to be a rearrangement of that as well. Okay, so you're open to think like, oh, she's crazy, this is not gonna happen. But I'm like, okay, Silicon Valley bros do blue sky stuff, like things around like, what if we have like a little bee, like, and drove around and like deliver your lunch? Would that be amazing? What do you have self-driving cars that can like turn into robots at certain intersections? And they just like love to like imagine things. So I'm like, let's be imaginative, let's just be free. Let's actually push the envelope of what we can imagine. Why do we have to be practical? And those bros were like, like when we were like, let's have these apartments where people live and work at the same time and get like people on food shop. Okay. Alright, let's have imagine free public education. Let's imagine the dissolution of private endowments and free higher education, period.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I especially appreciate your interest in policy, which of course would require building a coalition. And so, while I agree with 90% of what you expressed today, I was really curious about your use of the incident at Smith as an illustration of part of what's wrong, because I think you could have, for example, used any number of illustrations of like staff being exploited, like their reduction of their healthcare benefits, the way in which they have to kind of choose between lost wages and actively work because they're often unionized. But in choosing the incidents at Smith, you've sort of positioned the vulnerability of the Black woman student, who's vulnerable in terms of the state seeing her as sort of a non-citizen person, and also vulnerable by capitalism, right? Because she was threat to property values, and that's sort of the reason for the policing of her body.
I did what to her vulnerability?
Position her vulnerability in opposition to the vulnerability of the working class laborers at Smith. And it kind of
I'm going to stop right there for a second and just say, like, I don't think vulnerability is a term that I would use ever.
You wouldn't use the word vulnerability? Well, I'm going to. I think she's vulnerable to violence and made vulnerable by capitalistic processes and culture in a different way than our own staff at Smith. And your talk is sort of positioning the vulnerability in opposition to each other, instead of in a way that might build coalition, right? So, and I'm sort of wondering why you chose that example versus other dare I say, ordinary examples of the university or some colleges' exploitation of this type of work?
I don't know that this young woman is vulnerable to the state. And she's African American, she's pre-med. I feel that when we, and I say this as a mother, a young person too, like, we should not always promote this language of intersubjective vulnerability, and it was McCartney who I'm accusing. Like Canute, whatever she went through is authentic, whatever she went through is whatever she went through, right? There's no reason for McCartney to have suspended 2 of her staff members based on that Facebook post. Right? Canute was not demanding that they be suspended. She could call them names, that's fine, that's her Facebook post. Why did this woman, who makes $750,000 a year, feel that in 24 hours, on the basis of this, she could suspend a janitor who made $43,000 a year and a cafeteria worker who makes $43,000 a year, right? So that's the thing that I want to look at. I want to look at how the neoliberal, or whatever you call it, the president of the university can use a young woman's authentic expression of whatever she perceived to precipitate this action. It becomes the stage upon which McCartney performs her social, political enlightenment, right? That disguises the radical economic exploitation of these people. Canute is being instrumentalized here as an excuse. You know, this is the thing about our leaders of educational institutions right now, including the chancellor of UCI. He likes to do the, well, shucks, I'm just like you know. And I know Botstein likes to perform that he's the great protector of liberal arts, right? He's the great liberal protector of liberal arts, but it's always a kind of liberal arts that's very configured with regard to Cold War ideas, right? Against totalitarianism, about which Hannah Arendt wrote so eloquently, but also, I believed him too. Like, he wasn't going to go for these facile political solutions, he was a real liberal, but these positions are just stages upon which people who are in massive positions of power perform their progressive values. And that's the person that I was accusing of doing that, is McCartney. Canute is like 19 years old. You know, I don't believe everything my son says, right? He's 21, you know, but it's like someone has to be the adult in the room, take responsibility for all members of the community and say, let's see what happened here. How do you get to 24 hours after a Facebook post suspending your janitor? That's what outrages me.
And I agree with you. I think she was instrumentalized as well. I don't want to suggest otherwise. I just thought the rhetorical move of your talk. And because I think there are implications for it, that there's in framing it in the way that you did, you might be pulling in those members of a coalition who have resentment against racial minorities, right?
In framing my argument.
Not intentionally, right? I don't think that's your intention. I think if you express the idea of what you get in the answer in your talk, I wouldn't have anything to say.
Okay, so I framed that part was from a different essay, but right now I feel like the politics of anti-racism are being exploited and used by a capitalist class to actually dissolve and degrade institutional, solidarity. So I don't think it's me that's doing it, I think it's me pointing it out, and because I do criticize the language of anti-racism that comes out of the mouths of elites, then it's easy for people to say, well, I'm trying to foment more resentment. I'm actually trying to do the opposite, but I can understand that it's read that way. I feel like when I and Vivek Chibber were talking about the incident, we said, we have to have someone on the left criticize this situation, because everyone was talking about Smith from the right wing at that point. They were like, oh look, you can suspend white working class, doesn't matter, this young woman says something and it will please her, and I wanted to have that critique from the left. And I will continue to do that. Denounce facile anti-racism as a cover for destroying, as a cover for capitalist exploitation.
I can walk it, but. Thank you again for joining today. I guess I just have a few questions and points. I was wondering if you could provide an insight on the aggregate levels of small liberal arts college endowments versus public university
You mean
endowments.
aggregate? Oh, okay, so are you talking about like raw numbers?
Just generally, maybe even just an estimate.
Okay, so I believe that the small liberal arts college education, I have the numbers here, make up 1% of all college students. So this is a great,
Would the absorption of small liberal arts college endowments actually make any impact on the public education endowments, or would it be kind of just a marginal increase?
most public education institutions don't even have endowments. So the whole idea is to dissolve an endowment. Yale, Princeton, and Harvard are basically educational arms of giant endowments. Yale has $40 billion in endowment, Harvard has more, Princeton has more, and its endowment per student is above like $300,000. So, relative to that, BARD is actually rather modest, but this is literal hoarding. They take the money out of circulation, it builds interest, and why are they doing it? There's no real reason for them to have that much money, to sit on that much money. They say there's like plant maintenance and that they have, overhead costs, but the entire UC, which educates 400,000 students at any given time, has $1 billion endowment. Yale has 13,000 students, graduate and undergraduate, has a $40 billion endowment. So we're talking about like levels of endowment per student that are just difficult to imagine, right? So there are probably 40,000 students in a SLAC right now, right? In SLACs right now. In the States, there are 7 million students in community college in America. I'm not a math major, but if you think about like the number 40,000 versus 7 million, and that's only small liberal arts colleges. That's only community colleges, 2-year colleges. I'm not even talking about all public universities. There's this disproportionate amount of attention and even, space, like physical space, because real estate is so commodified, given to 40,000 people versus 7.7 million.
I guess another question I have is whether there could be an instance where liberal arts colleges could coexist with universities so long as there was an instance of accessibility for education through a public university system for everybody to want.
It's totally possible to imagine that liberal arts colleges could become the humanities departments of SUNY. That could be easily done. They can make their little robots can deliver you your lunch in the sky. They have little flags, you order your lunch on your phone and they come to you, and I'm like, why do we need this? And so we can imagine other things we can do with our resources. There's absolutely no reason why that can't happen, actually, I think. But, obviously there are a lot of reasons why that can't happen, why that won't happen, but I think we can imagine it, we can start thinking about it.
Next question in the back.
Great, thank you.
I was really interested in what you were talking about generally also with the example you used, what happened at Smith and just about the general kind of performativeness of how a lot of colleges, you know, are always putting students of color on the pamphlets, and you know they're known to be progressive and liberal, and then the liberal elite people identify with, you know, being anti-racist, and the connection to liberal arts colleges having such a performative, you know,
It's not just liberal arts colleges, but yeah, there's this performative progressivism that is definitely saturates more of your culture than say the culture of a large public university.
I'm just wondering, how do you feel that this functions within the reality of the rest of society, and how this kind of might foster resentment towards things like affirmative action, when colleges might display a false sense of equality by showing like sort of a mini public in which there's a lot of diversity and everybody is equal.
You know, I don't have a direct response to that, but I think that we can see that there are raw statistics that average African American assets fell during the Obama administration. Relative to every other racial group in America. So we had this like liberal African American man representing the progressivism of the United States, and he did nothing to protect African American homeowners from predatory lenders who foreclosed on their homes. Every working class and middle class person's largest asset is their home. Obama bailed out the banks, and he did not enforce a moratorium on foreclosures that actually precipitated enormous amounts of homelessness, loss of assets during the Obama administration. So there is no guarantee that the Democratic Party is not designed to like actually help working class people. It's designed to allow this kind of performative liberalism to take place and to protect the assets of the very wealthy. I feel like that act in and of itself is just one of the most atrocious things that I've ever witnessed in my life. The fact that the banks were bailed out and not homeowners, and that African Americans saw the greatest drop in assets under his administration. I mean, I'm not saying that there is I am implying that the politics of our time period has created a kind of polarization that is subtended by a material base of economic deprivation and exploitation. More African Americans voted for Trump in the last election than anyone expected. Working class Latinos voted in great numbers for Trump than anyone expected. And there is in California today among Asian Americans an incredible disillusionment with the Democratic Party as a progressive force. Because of the politics of San Francisco, because of the politics of policing. I mean, it's very, very complex. If we have two parties today and neither party represents the interests of the working class, it's a complete disaster. The Republicans do it cosmetically to foment some resentment. The Democrats do it performatively and are portraying working class interests every day. And so what kind of world are we headed to when both sides are doing this performative politics, as you say?
I think there's a question down here.
Thank you. I know that you are also working on a book about trauma and authenticity, and based on my 4 years at Harvard and nonprofits and activist spaces, it seems like that is kind of the new crucial PMC value and the central conception of everything is both
Of
trauma.
politics and intersubjectivity.
Yeah, trauma and authenticity. So I wonder if you could, I know you're writing a whole text on it, but just expand a little bit about how small liberal arts colleges or college academia is becoming a site for that in particular.
Yeah, it's a really long argument that I'm gonna make, but but that I'm trying to make in the book, but I'll try to be very succinct. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a great crisis in academia that started around like deconstruction and Paul de Man's relationship to his Nazi past, right? And then these people, these figures that I actually studied with at Yale, they came up with trauma studies and the ethics of listening and witnessing, because there was the establishment of a Holocaust archive that was an incredible project of people building on videos of all these Holocaust survivors who were, dying out by that time. And Kathy Caruth and Shoshana Feldman started to talk about this act of witnessing, listening, ethical listening. And some of their ideas came out of psychoanalysis. I think there were misreadings of psychoanalysis, but there became this like new sort of engagement with politics, or pseudo-engagement with politics that had to do with just like being an attentive listener, which actually promoted kind of political passivity and asceticized the intersubjective relation. And at the same time, or almost at the same time, you have the Soviet Union falling, and Oprah Winfrey is building an incredible empire of daytime television where a new way of talking about personal suffering was highly mediatized at that point. I mean, in 1986, she went on television and told of being molested as a child, and that was electrifying. So a lot of the progressive points of like the 60s, which were, the personal is the political, also reached fruition in the institutions, in media and academia in the 80s and the 90s, when you had this way of saying, well, my personal suffering and you're listening to it can be a political transaction, can be an authenticator of some kind of ethical relation. And it's just been, I feel like 2021, 2022 is peak trauma industry culture. Because Encanto, Growing Red, even Everything Everywhere All at Once is about generalizing this language of intergenerational trauma that is highly popular, highly commodified. And one of the things that Eva Illouz said about Oprah's incredible power in doing this thing was that she established a trauma script. So the ways in which many people talk about their suffering actually seems very standardized now. It doesn't seem individualized. If you listen to this, it's like everyone seems to have they replicate the script, and it creates a kind of, in fancy Marxist talk, a highly reified form of communication. But if you counter that, if you try to be skeptical, you're immediately labeled as an abuser yourself, right? Or any kind of skepticism. And in fact, Oprah has created an entire channel on Apple TV called The Me You Can't See, where Lady Gaga, Prince Harry, and just very, very famous people talk about terrible things that happened to them. And it's very, very compelling, right? She's a great interviewer and it's very high production value, but you have this celebrity telling you about their suffering. And and that is supposed to be some kind of therapeutic healing relationship that you can have as well. But what I think is really happening is that, I think that we're unable to individuate because we're consuming these narratives of trauma where there is no particularity any longer. They're being so mass-produced, but and in the trauma book, I will talk about this too. This is a real rearrangement of how one publicly speaks about suffering. So if you look at a lot of studies of working class people now who are, really in a bad situation, like within coal country or Appalachia, these ethnographies talk about this kind of like stoicism, where endurance and suffering are highly valued, but there's not this kind of promotion of suffering, the narrative as trauma. The narrative is actually about how I endured, not about how I'm vulnerable, how I've been made vulnerable. And so this PMC rearrangement of the narrative of suffering, this all comes back to this, will be, is promoted at a moment when really existing socialism is dying. So one of the great things that American liberalism can now say is to the whole world is, we have perfected a public reckoning with suffering. And that's why we're the most advanced and liberal country. And our form of being is the most advanced in the world. And other countries, totalitarian countries make their people suffer, but we allow our people to talk about suffering. So in 2021, a book called The Routledge Companion to Literature and Trauma just came out. And because it's on a PDF, I can do a hard, brute force search on economic crisis or socialism. No mention in 2008, the economic crisis that created so much suffering for Americans. No mention of socialism or communism except as the source of trauma. So what is permissible there, and I think Leon would really like this too, it's like, I really suffered under totalitarian regimes. That's a permissible script. But if you do brute force search on capitalism, it barely exists in this book, and it's like 800 pages. So it's doing a lot of work for the culture industry, dominated by the PMC. And it's more complicated than that, but also this is the short version of what I'm trying to work on.
I think there's a question right
Thanks very much, Cal. I'm someone who's very much profited from your work. I love your book. I teach it, the Virtue Hoarders book. And I do a lot of work on some similar questions. So I want to thank you for being here and coming back forward. And I really do agree with some of the critiques, a lot of your critiques of the progressive movement and the liberal arts coming. I have a comment and two short questions. I'm going to keep everything brief with a longer question. The comment is just, since we're at Bard and you take on Bard, I just do want to say that Bard has, I think, a big distinguishing itself from other liberal art colleges. The early college program, which is 68% school lunch eligible students, is, I think, a program that talks. The not talks the talk, but walks the walk, I think. You can disagree. The micro colleges, the prison program, the Clemente program. And we didn't have an endowment in the last 45 years. We just started building one as a necessity, not really as something we believe in. So I just thought it was important that having you at Bard to at least comment on some of those things. The first question I have is a brief question, which is that my parents' generation of lower-class Jews went to CUNY and got great educations at CUNY, and they were all educated in public institutions. And then CUNY let everybody in, took out standards, they went downhill, and everyone went to private elite colleges. I know you say we should bring back public education, which I fully agree with. Do you think there should be standards, admission standards in public education? That's one easy question, or not easy, but quick question. The second question is, you've talked about the PMC as a class, and I wonder if it is. I mean, they seem to have very different interests. I mean, what unites an undergraduate at Bard, a nonprofit worker, me, the president of Bard College, and a CEO who works for environmental groups, all party members of some way, the PMC in some sense. They have wildly different interests. Interestingly enough, Hannah Arendt, right? This is a Hannah Arendt Center event, argues that the problem with intellectuals is that it's not that they're a class, but they become ideological. They separate themselves from reality by hiding behind ideas, and they lose sight of reality. And she says they become racist against uneducated people. And that what her critique of what the PMC would not be as a class, but as an ideological movement. And I'm wondering if that at all, and she makes that critique in Nonviolence, and I'm wondering if that at all makes sense to you. But my biggest question is that, you know, the problem, it seems to me, with liberal education is not that it's elitist. It's that it's become a necessary function for everyone else. And my question is, isn't there a value to elitism? I mean, you and I, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marx, these are people who could not have done what they did without an elite education. And it seems to me that I'm just wondering to what extent the problem is not liberal arts education, liberal arts colleges, but the idea that everyone has to do the same thing. And is there a value to
Get the
elitism?
credential.
Yeah, so.
So, should there be standards, right? So, I've always thought, like, we should operate more like those giant bio-sci classes for pre-med students in public universities. Everyone can register for biology or organic chemistry, but only 30% pass first year. But everyone can register. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I think that actually functions as good triage. And those students who don't pass, they don't drop out of the UC. They go and they realize they should probably be in psychology or public health or in the humanities. So we place such high stakes in this admission process. And not succeeding just seems so devastating and catastrophic. How can we mitigate that? And the only way we can mitigate that is by devaluing the credential. And so I agree with, so that's what I've been thinking about with regard to open admissions and sort of, well, you need selection at some point, right? But why don't you make it selection internal to the institution, internal to the class, to the class you're taking? You know, Arendt is not a Marxist, so obviously, and I tend to be more orthodox on this level. There are no ideological movements that are not class-based. The thing that we all have in common, like all of us on different tiers, is that we're non-productive workers. Our work is ideological production. So this is really hard to swallow because we've made the logistic lines so great. But the workers who are producing for capital are people working in the Pearl River Delta. They're probably being paid maybe $30 a day now, pretty well. They produce this iPhone, right? Tim Cook gets the most of that surplus value from that labor. There are about 1.5 million people who work on the lines for Apple. But from everything from I'm talking mining to the hardware production. But the people who are paid most are the engineers, the designers, the people under Tim Cook, the people who are in Palo Alto, right? And we're all at least in California, we do profit a great deal from this because the tax base is in California, right? But the people who should actually be seeing the profits, the people who are producing the profits, the surplus value, are not seeing anything at all. They're in Pearl River Delta. Now you could say, why do I care about the Chinese worker? And there is a kind of isolationism that I could promote here, why don't we bring production of iPhones back to the United States? They would probably cost $10,000, right? But that would be because of the labor and workers who do not get a college degree could go work at Apple and make $100,000 a year constructing these things, and these would cost more, right? There's a whole way of reorganizing surplus value. There's so much surplus value that we're living on parasitically now. Because labor is so cheap and the logistics lines are so long from here to the Pearl River Delta, soon to be moving to Vietnam, because the formula for capitalism right now is to pay workers as little as possible. And that has been so successful that now the capitalists can give money like Soros or speculate on capital so that we each get a small share of that surplus value. And our positions might be diverse, but fundamentally, we all live off of surplus value. So that's like the more orthodox Marxist reading. And so it's not like, and so it is in our class interest, because we want the iPhone to only cost $1,000 to keep that logistics line there. So no matter how you phrase this, I still think we should pay workers their value. We should bring production lines back to the United States. I think that the great migration of African Americans to the Northeast, to the Midwest, right after Second World War, and California had to do with good manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs paved the way for a kind of middle-class prosperity for the great majority of Americans. U.S. Steel may not be a very clean company, but most of Americans, the steel that we use in America now is being produced in my home province in China. And the pollution there is massive. And the steel workers who used to make like $35, $45 an hour are making $12, $13 an hour in Western Pennsylvania. And we've outsourced all of these dirty industries that we still need based on these logistics lines. Now, am I saying anti-globalization? Yes. Am I like an economic nationalist? Maybe, but I really do care about the American working class, even though I'm Chinese American. And this whole globalization thing has really helped my family's material conditions. There's still, none of them in China has finished college, except for like my one cousin. And they live much better than they did, 20, 30, especially 40 years ago.
So what about the value of elitism? Is there any value to an elite education?
Yeah, of course, it's very valuable right now, I mean, the way that things are organized, it's extremely valuable.
So, this unfortunately is the end of our discussion. But please.
Because I'm a materialist, not an idealist. So if you all came to me and I was your college counselor, like, where should I go to college? I would say, go to the most elite place you got into. I'm not a crazy person. I'm a pragmatist.
But please join me in a round of applause for